All right, welcome to this live stream with Debbie Levison. Thank you for being here. My name is Genevieve Parker. I'm the Community Engagement Manager with Twin Cities Jewfolk, and I am here to introduce author and publicist Deborah Levison, whose life has two parts, the first in Canada, where she attended the University of Toronto and the Royal Conservatory of Music, and the second in Connecticut, where she lives with a husband, three children, and a doodle named Moose. By trade, she is a writer and publicist. Her debut book, The Crate, A Story of War, a Murder, and Justice, is a true crime story with echoes of the Holocaust. The book has received 7 literary awards to date. Most recently, it took first place nonfiction by the Connecticut Press Club and went on to the national competition where it took second place. New York Times bestselling authors Lee Child called it impressive and important, and James Rowland said it was a gut punch with such harrowing moments that you have to stop and take a breath. Other reviewers have called it gorgeous and poetic, heart-wrenching, and a brilliant story. And Debbie, I'm so excited to hear what you have to talk to us about tonight, so please take it on away.
Well, thank you, Genevieve, for inviting me, and thanks for tuning in. I'm also very excited to tell you a little bit about this book, The Crate, A Story of War, a Murder, and Justice. And I'll just start by telling you, I've always wanted to be an author. I literally don't think there was ever a time when I walked into a library or a bookstore without wishing that I had my own story to tell. But this book is not one that I ever expected to write in a million years, because this is the story of a really gruesome crime that involved my family. And just to give you a very quick overview of the crime part of the book, it started in 2010 with a phone call. My brother called my cell phone and he said, "Deb, there's been a murder." He said a crate had been discovered. It was nailed really tightly shut, and it was hidden underneath our family cottage about 2 hours north of Toronto in Ontario. And when that crate was opened, the contents were the most horrific thing you can imagine. And this whole discovery just rocked my family. You know, first of all, there was obviously a 911 call, which triggered the media, and then the reporters and the television crews sort of descended on what was a very private sanctuary of ours. And meanwhile, I had 3 children that I wanted to protect from the horror of the whole thing. Um, my husband and I were totally freaked out. My brother became the initial murder suspect. But the worst part of the whole thing was that my parents were traumatized. And so in order for you really to understand how this whole situation affected my family, you have to know a little bit about our backgrounds, how it all started. So I'll just tell you very briefly. I grew up in Toronto in a very quiet house, a very immaculate house where I walked on eggshells. I was always afraid to disobey or to be disrespectful in any way, because I always felt like if I said the wrong thing or did the wrong thing, my parents would just shatter. They just seemed so fragile. And we just seemed so different from the other families in the neighborhood, families that had, you know, lots of aunts and uncles and cousins coming to visit, and these big backyard birthday parties with all this extended family. And in my family, it was just my brother and me and our parents and one grandmother. And that was it, the extent of the family. And it felt to me like we were this little lone island of 5 people living in this sea of Canadians who somehow belonged, and we didn't. You know, we ate different foods, we spoke a different language, we dressed differently. So when I started kindergarten, I didn't speak English, I spoke Hungarian. And my mother insisted on dressing me in these thick, ugly Eastern European style clothes that were built to last forever, but they were so out of style. And even as a child, I knew it. And then she would cook these big vats of these really mushy stews, things that made my friends kind of grimace when they came over for dinner. Um, because that was economical. She could make a big pot of something that would last 4 or 5 dinners because we didn't have money back then. And there was no such thing as what she called American food. So even though we were Canadian living in Toronto, my parents called anything that wasn't Hungarian American. So there was no prepared food, nothing like fast food or restaurants. Everything was always made from scratch and prepared at home. And in fact, my parents had a real suspicion of anything that wasn't Hungarian. And I vividly recall my first encounters with this so-called American food. And I'll just give you one example. So I must have been about 8 years old. My brother is 11 years older than me, and he must have been about 19. So it was a Saturday night, and I was alone in the kitchen, and he came in and he looked around very furtively to see if my parents were around, and they weren't. So he opens up his backpack and he took out this little cardboard box and he very carefully slid it to the very, very back of the refrigerator. And I whispered, "Is it drugs?" And he said, "No, chow mein." And, there are all these examples of things that set our family apart, things that made us feel more like strangers in a strange land. But the weird thing is that Canada is a country of immigrants, and Toronto especially is a city of immigrants. So really, there were lots of other families who spoke a different language or dressed differently or ate different foods. We were not unique in that regard. So what was it that set us apart? I never really knew, but to me, it felt like there was this shadow over our lives. So my parents had come to Canada in 1956 as refugees, and they came with nothing but the clothes on their backs, no money, no job prospects, no language. My brother, who was 3 years old, they brought him over in a knapsack, and they never, ever spoke about what had happened to them. But looking back as an adult, I can see there were all these clues. So for instance, one time my mother decided that I needed a beach robe. Now, we didn't have money for luxuries like that, but she was very resourceful. So she took 2 towels and she sewed them together, and she left a little hole for the head and holes for the arms. And I remember standing there as a little girl watching her sew with these very neat little stitches. And I said, "Oh, did grandma teach you how to sew?" And she said, "Well, as a matter of fact, she did. We used to sit together for hours sewing patches on all the clothes." And at the time, I remember thinking that she meant the patches that she put on my brother's blue jeans when he ripped the knees. I didn't realize that she was talking about the yellow Jewish star patches that everyone was required to wear during the Holocaust. And then she would make these very cryptic comments when when she thought no one was around. She would say things like, "Be glad you never had to eat worms," or "It's colder than the ghetto in here," or "What we would have given to eat this in the ghetto." And meanwhile, my father, he had a whole bunch of his own idiosyncrasies. He would come home from work and sit down at the dinner table, and my mother would put a plate of food in front of him, and he would lower his head and gobble up the food so fast that night after night after night, he choked. And he would lean back and try to take air in around this big mouthful of food, and my mom would jump up and clap him on the back, and she would say something like, "He does that because he was starving when he was young." And it was very scary, and I didn't understand, But because I walked on eggshells, I never asked why. So more than anything, I wanted relatives, relatives who were like us, relatives who made us feel less like strangers in this strange land, relatives who sort of who validated our presence in North America. Um, Instead of relatives, my parents had this very close-knit circle of friends. And they didn't go out to restaurants or movies. They just entertained each other on like Saturday nights for dinners. And I remember I would look out into the living room or the dining room to see what was happening. And everyone seemed to be having this great time. They would be laughing and eating until someone made some offhand remark. And then it would be like this black curtain just coming down. All of a sudden, the laughter would stop. And again, I never understood why. So when my brother and I were small, my parents had a mantra. They would say, education, education, education. With their heavy accents, they would say, people can take everything away from you except your education. And I never understood, why would somebody take something away from me? So it wasn't until I was a teenager that I started to hear a little bit about my mother's story. And it wasn't until I was a married woman with children of my own that I started to learn what happened to my father. So I'm going to pause here and put on some slides for you and just let me know if this works. Okay. Do you have a blue slide? Anybody?
Not yet.
No? You don't have it yet?
I don't yet.
Okay, give me one more sec. Trying.
Debbie, have you hit share screen in
Yep.
Zoom?
Yep.
Yeah.
Not working?
Mm-mm.
Worked a second ago, right?
Good.
Try this again.
It will soon.
Yeah. How about now?
There we are.
Whew. That was scary for a sec. Okay. All right. So let me just catch you up with some pictures. So again, Canada. This is the house where I grew up. This small, very immaculate house. Now, readers always ask about the food that I talk about in my book. So I decided to throw in some slides. And these are actually pictures of some of the things that I hate the most. On the left, kachonyás hal is this fish in jello. It's actually aspic. And on the right is this stew, kel kapusta főzelék, this stew made of cabbage and bacon, and it's awful. But my mother was actually an amazing cook when she wanted to impress. So when people came over, she would make the good stuff, and then especially the desserts. So I don't know if you guys in the Twin Cities have any real European bakeries, but you may have seen some of this, the cherry strudel and the dobosh, that's so iconically Hungarian. On the left is this chestnut puree that I always talk about in the book, which is my favorite thing. And on the right, crepes my mom made, usually filled with chocolate, rum balls, and on the right are plum dumplings, which are incredibly good. Each one weighs about 10 pounds. It's this heavy potato dough, but again, this amazing Hungarian meal. So here are just some pictures of the relatives from the shoebox. Obviously people I had never met before, but also people that no one ever spoke about. And my mother was from Budapest, you can see there in the middle of the country. And I always show a few pictures of the city because it's just such a breathtaking place. When I went there, I was really surprised that, you know, the beautiful architecture. This is the Parliament building, and the tourist attractions are just very spectacular in scope. This is one of the main retail streets of Budapest, Váci utca, and very upscale. And look at this cafe. Like, isn't this just beautiful? It's so ornate. And the outside, the exterior of the synagogue where my mother's family belonged. So they were not at all religious, but they went once a year, you know, the high holidays. And here's the interior of the synagogue. Again, so beautiful and ornate. And the reason I show these is because when I went to Hungary to sort of do a pilgrimage, to trace my parents' stories, it just struck me as so odd that people who could surround themselves with such beauty, people who were capable of creating such beauty around themselves, were also capable of such ugliness. So here's my mom at about 3 years of age, and she was a very normal child. She was an only child, and she had just a very nice, normal childhood. Here she is at about 11, pictured with my grandmother, and all smiles, so clearly before the German occupation of 1944. And here's my grandfather, my mother's father. Again, somebody that was never discussed, never spoken about, so I didn't know anything about him. I didn't know that he was a very kind man. I didn't know that he drove a taxi for a living. And I didn't know that a gang of Nazi youths had dragged him out of his apartment in front of his wife and daughter, my mother, and beaten him to a pulp in the street. And that shortly after that, he was trucked away to a forced labor camp, where he was beaten some more, eventually dying of those injuries. And here's my mom in her school uniform. So my mom attended a Scottish mission school in Budapest because it was known to have the best academic program. And she had a couple of different uniforms. Some of them were a little bit more formal and ornate with gold epaulettes and gold buttons down the front. And she said they did a lot of parading around the city. And Hungary then, and still is very nationalistic. So they did a lot of marching. And the school that my mother attended was founded by this woman, Jane Haining, a Scottish missionary. And if you've never heard about Jane, you really should. Sarah's smiling as if she knows a little bit about Jane, but I'll just tell you quickly. She was one of the founders of the school. And under her watch, the school grew in reputation so much that eventually the student population was half Jewish and half non-Jewish, even though it was a missionary school. And of those students, half of them actually boarded at the school, and half of them were the day students who went home at night, like my mom. When things got bad, when it wasn't safe for students to go out in the streets anymore, and the deportations in Budapest had begun, the Scottish Church actually recalled all its missionaries back to Scotland from all over Europe. And Jane Haining happened to be on holiday in Scotland when that happened, excuse me. And she decided to defy that directive and travel back to Budapest because she said that her place was protecting the Jewish children in her charge. And so at great peril to herself, she traveled back to Budapest, where she went back to the school and of course was called out as a collaborator. And she was sent to Auschwitz along with her Jewish students, and she perished in the gas chambers there. So Jane is thought to be one of, if not the only Scottish national to die in Auschwitz. And my mother was very, very sad to hear about her passing because she was a very kind, very lovely woman. And there are a whole bunch of memorials to her all over Budapest in Scotland and at Yad Vashem in Israel too. So here's just a couple of examples of the propaganda of the times, what was all over Budapest. This one in Hungarian says ghetto nekik, which is, it's the ghetto for them. And here we begin with the deportations, the roundup of women first in Budapest, and then the liquidation of the Jewish hospital. This was the patients and the staff. And eventually being taken to the Budapest ghetto. So when you think of the ghetto, you know, people who ask me about my parents' experiences, and I say, well, my mom was in the ghetto. I don't think that carries enough weight because I don't think people really understand what the circumstances were like in these ghettos in Warsaw and Budapest and these other cities. First of all, there were different tiers of suffering. The people who happened to be within the perimeters of the ghetto when they created those artificial borders, the walls of the ghetto, those people who could stay in their own apartments were the luckiest because clearly they had the most resources at their disposal. They had money and they had food and their valuables. And then the people who were brought in from the rest of the city had less. They were only able to bring, you know, a few suitcases of what they could carry. And then the people who were brought in from the countryside, the hundreds of thousands of Jews who were rounded up and brought into the city from the countryside were the least fortunate because often they were only given maybe an hour to pack a bag of their most valuable things. And those were the people who, once they were in the ghetto, had the least to trade because eventually the food that was available, you know, the soup kitchens and whatever the relief organizations there inside the ghetto could provide, it ran out. And then it became a matter of bartering with the guards. And the people who, you know, who had come with just a suitcase of whatever had the least to trade for food. And those were the people who began to starve the fastest. And so these scenes from around the ghettos were commonplace of people dying in the streets of disease and hunger. And so this is what my mom, as a 13-year-old girl living in the ghetto, this is the kind of thing that she saw on a daily basis. So meanwhile, my father was born in Balachadyarmat, a village on the northern border. You can see it right there up at the top, just under the name Slovakia. And like my mom, he had a very normal childhood. He had one sister who he was very close to. And it was like a very wholesome kind of rural upbringing, small village. When Hungary annexed Czechoslovakia, they suddenly had access to the Carpathian Mountains. And so they did a lot of skiing, a lot of skating on frozen ponds and that kind of thing. So here's my dad at about 15 years of age. And it's an undated photo, but you can still see he has that kind of adolescent chubbiness in his cheeks still. And so my dad was actually 17 when the Germans invaded his village in March of 1944, just as they did in Budapest. So he was 17 when he was brought to the ghetto. And so first from the ghetto, his father was taken almost immediately to a work camp. And then he was there with his mother and sister. And he remembers thinking that the worst thing would be if they didn't allow him to graduate high school because he really wanted to go to university in the fall. He really wanted to become an engineer. And he knew that if he didn't have a high school diploma, he wouldn't be able to go to university. So he was thinking along these very normal lines of how his life timeline would sort of play out. And of course, it didn't happen that way at all. After they took away the adult males, they came back for the younger boys. And at 17, my dad was one of the youngest of a group of 200 boys who were taken away and put on a cattle car. And again, like the concept of ghetto, the concept of cattle car, unless you know what happened, it doesn't, it sounds innocent, but it was not. My dad was shoved onto this car, this train car that was meant for livestock, shoved on with the butts of Nazi rifles, packed in so tight that these boys couldn't lift their arms from their sides. And he was on that car for 5 days. 5 days of standing up with no food. The only water was what they sprayed through the windows with hoses. No opportunity to sit down, to relieve himself, nothing. And, in neighboring cattle cars, women would give birth standing up. People were dying standing up. Teenage boys dying standing up. So he was on that train ride for 5 days. And when the train car doors opened, my father found himself in the first of 3 concentration camps. So now this is an internet photo. I was not able to find a photo of the first camp called Fertorakos. When you Google the name of that camp, all that comes up is pictures of a very quaint little town. And of course, that's not what it looked like back then. So the first thing my father saw when the train cars opened and they sort of stumbled off, whoever was still alive, the first thing he saw was a barbed wire fence with bodies caught up on top. Bodies that had been left there to rot as a lesson to the prisoners about trying to escape. So my father was in that camp for a few months before being taken on a death march, another cattle car ride, and then another death march to this place in Austria, Mauthausen. So I'm guessing this is a name that you're familiar with. It's one of the more well-known of the concentration camps. I'm not going to say good or bad, but I will say that Mauthausen was intentionally created as a brutal place because Mauthausen happened to be one of the destinations for what the Germans called the incorrigible political enemies of the Reich. So a lot of political prisoners were at Mauthausen. So I just want to tell you a little bit about this place. So first of all, Mauthausen is the umbrella name for a group of concentration camps. And you can see that it was built into a quarry with very sheer granite cliffs. And I can't really show you from the scope of this picture because I had to format the picture to fit the frame. But the cliffs are actually very high. And it was a working quarry, so the prisoners there were required to do the stonework, which for them meant the stairs of death. There was a set of stairs that went from the bottom of the valley to the top of the cliffs. And it was the prisoner's job to bring blocks of granite from the bottom to the top. Now, the average weight of the granite blocks was about 110 pounds. The average weight of the adult male prisoner at Mauthausen was 88 pounds. I'll just let that sink in for a second. So it was their job to carry these stone blocks up the stairs if they could, because remember, they were not being fed. So what happened was a domino effect. One man would become dizzy or would faint, holding his block on his back, and would fall backwards, and then all of the people climbing the stairs behind him would fall as a result. So the Nazi guards had a very favorite activity, what they would do at the end of each workday. They would choose 2 prisoners and they would make them race up the stairs with their granite blocks on their backs after a full day of work. Whoever won the race, whoever made it to the top first, that person was given a choice. Either shoot the man in front of him or jump off the cliff himself. That was the choice. And again, here's a sort of stretched out view of the stairs, which were actually much steeper, but you can get an idea of how it looked with the prisoners doing this backbreaking work. And then being, sorry, too fast. And then being taken to what they called the parachutist's wall, where they were given the choice of jumping or killing someone. So a few more things about Mauthausen. First of all, the survivors of the camp report that there were something like 63 different ways that the guards had of killing the prisoners. So first of all, they kept these barrels of water handy all around the camp, just in case they needed to randomly drown a prisoner in a barrel of water for some infraction. And then they had things like the ice showers, they called them, where in the winters they would make the prisoners take showers and then they would die of hypothermia as a result. My father somehow managed to survive Mauthausen, and he turned 18 while he was at that camp. But then in the spring, he was taken on yet another death march to one of the sub-camps of Mauthausen called Gunskirchen. And it was there that he spent the last few months somehow clinging to life. And it was there in May of 1945 that the American army came to liberate the camp. So my dad talked a little bit about those soldiers, those young boys, 18 years old themselves, who came to liberate these concentration camps and who were absolutely traumatized because they had no idea. They had no idea what the Nazis had perpetrated in these camps. And so they came and, you know, scenes like this were commonplace, just the ground littered with dead bodies, because by then, nobody had the strength to bury the dead. The mass graves were full. And of course, this doesn't account for all the people who had gone up in smoke from the gas chambers. So all of this, and all, you know, this is clearly summarized. This is not all the detail, but all of this, my father never talked about. So he never told me that when he was liberated by the American Allies, he weighed less than 100 pounds. And he never talked about the lice or the torture and the beatings and the hunger and starvation. He never talked about any of it. And looking back now as an adult, I have to say I'm glad, because even now, you know, forget about when I was a kid, but even now as a grown-up, I'm haunted by the things that I know, the things that I know took place during the Holocaust. You know, and a lot of the audiences that I speak to are not Jewish. Many are not well versed in what happens in the Holocaust. I don't like to be too grueling when I speak to kids. I have to be very gentle, obviously, with that approach. But I also don't think that it serves a purpose to dilute what happened. And so I try to find that balance between giving the actual information of what happened and not scarring people. But you know what? We're scarred. We children, the Holocaust survivors themselves, we families of the Holocaust survivors are scarred. So, you know, I do give a few examples, like how Nazis held babies by their ankles and smashed their heads against rocks to kill them, and how there was one incident where a group of Gestapo made villagers dig 3 pits, Jewish villagers, dig 3 pits, one for the men, one for the women, and one for the children. And then all the Jews were pushed in and buried alive. And then there was an incident that took place in Lodz. at a hospital that was being raided and cleansed of the Jewish patients, where a few of the younger Nazi guards went up to the maternity floor and began throwing bundles out of the windows. And guards down at the ground would try to spear those bundles with the bayonets on their rifles. And of course, those bundles were the newborn babies from the maternity wards. And then there was something in Treblinka where a German Shepherd dog, a guard dog, had the audacity to lick the face of a Jewish child. And for that, the dog was savagely beaten before the guard trampled the baby to death. So I could go on and on and on with examples, everything documented, of course, but you know, it finally dawned on me as an adult that when my parents drilled education, education, education into my head as a child, it also meant that I had an obligation to educate the world about what had happened to them. And so that's why in my book, The Crate, I took great pains to tell their stories and intertwine their history with the crime that happened to my family. So I'll continue on the story from here. So my father actually spent 3 months in an American infirmary tent before he was strong enough to walk out of that concentration camp, out of Gunskirchen, and make his way back to Budapest. And he first went to the Budapest ghetto to see if his grandparents had survived, but they had not. They had starved to death in the ghetto. From there, he made his way 2 hours north to his village to try to find his parents and his sister, but they were gone, along with all the other Jews of the village, gone. And he had absolutely no idea what had happened to them, except that rumor had it that almost all the villagers had been taken to Auschwitz. So he assumed that's what happened to his family too. Interestingly, that wasn't quite the full story. And so there's this whole side story that I have to tell in the book, but I'm not going to go into that part of it right now. Anyway, after a couple of years of being back in Hungary, my father was ironically conscripted into the Hungarian army as a ham radio operator before he finally met my mother here a few years later. I think this is 1948 now, and you can see even years after liberation how much thinner my father looks, how his face has just thinned out so much even years later, and how sad he looks. But my parents were married in 1949 and then had my brother in 1953 and in Hungary. And then it was in 1956 that they were actually able to escape. So now they're escaping communism, first fascism, now communism in Hungary. And they were able to escape to Austria by foot. From there, make their way onto the Empress of Britain, which had a quota of 600 refugees per voyage to New Brunswick, Newfoundland. I'm sorry, New Brunswick, Canada. And so my parents were lucky to get on that voyage, but they eventually landed in Canada in 1957. This is after they had settled in a little bit. And here are their residency cards, so a few years later still. And here we are, 1965, because this is my first birthday. So our little family of 5 people, my parents were able to scrape together enough money to sponsor my grandmother to come out of Hungary a few years after they arrived. So 65. So as time went by, my family really wanted what they saw everybody else in Toronto society had, which was a place up north, a cottage where they could go on weekends and for the summers, a place that they could call their own, a place that they could build from the ground up that nobody could take away from them, and a place that would really be a refuge from all their terrible memories. And that's what they wanted. In 1972, that dream of having a cottage began to take shape. Of course, the first thing that had to go up was the outhouse. But in 1972, my parents began construction on their cottage, which they built by hand and their sweat and their toil. And it was really their sanctuary. And so this is the setting for what later was this terrible crime. And here are just a couple of iconic pictures of the lake that we overlook. Very pretty, very pristine place. That's the 80s. Woo! My brother, when he still had a lot of hair, and me when I still had a lot of hair in the 80s. And here, this side view of the cottage shows you how the land really slopes down towards the water. And it was in that sort of angled space underneath between the floor of the cottage and the ground. That's where the crate was discovered. So just a couple more pictures. These are actually OPP crime scene photos that I'm going to go through really quick. OPP is Ontario Provincial Police. So this is the night that the crate was opened, and then the following morning you can see everything all cordoned off. They must have used miles of crime scene tape, and just some photos of a renovation that we had before and after. And I'll just go through this really quick, but this is the crawl space where the crate was discovered, and the crate itself. Some evidence that you have to read the book to understand. But here is a picture of the victim, Samantha. Now, everybody always asks why I wrote this book. So clearly the one reason is because I wanted to tell my parents' stories, but really the other reason is after the discovery of the crate, after it was in all these headlines, magazines and newspapers, and we were, reeling from this discovery, it occurred to me that everything that we were going through was nothing compared to what the victim's family must have been feeling. Clearly all the sense of violation and drama and everything that we were going through paled in comparison to a family losing their daughter and their mother. And so as a writer, I thought I could give Samantha a voice. I could tell her story so that she wouldn't be forgotten and so that people would know what happened to her. And a couple more pictures of characters from the book. He is the lead detective who interrogated my brother when he was a suspect. Some more of the suspects and some more before we get to Samantha again. So this really is a story of violence in the past, violence in the present, and it's a story of education, and it's a warning. And the other reasons that I wrote the book are for my children, because I wanted them to know their family history, and I wanted the next generation to know everything that I had not been taught, everything that they did not learn in school, because I don't know how it is out there in Minnesota, but here Holocaust education was only mandated 1.5 years ago, and it's still sort of trickling into the curriculum. But when I was a kid, we didn't learn anything about the Holocaust, and my kids didn't learn anything. So I really wanted to use this opportunity as education. And especially because of Holocaust denial, which on the internet is so rampant, especially because it's anonymous, but here you can see in person as well. And like I said, education, education, education. And then these statistics drive me crazy. You may have heard of the iconic now survey of millennials a couple of years ago, where 1/4 of them weren't sure if they'd ever heard of the Holocaust, didn't know what Auschwitz was, didn't know how many Jews were murdered, So these statistics make me crazy that we have a generation of young adults who don't know what happened. So I think that's where I will, oh, well, I can tell some more stories if you're interested, but I'll come back to this. If there's time, if you're interested, I'll come back to this. But okay, so this is my husband and my in-laws. And I always show this picture because my father-in-law, who was born in Germany, had a very poignant story himself. And I don't know what time we're at here because my screen is covered, but Genevieve, how much time do we have?
It's 7:57, but feel free to keep going.
Yeah, you're not bored yet? Okay, so I'll tell you my father-in-law's story, and then I'll go back to that other slide. So Benny was born in Germany, and he was born in a place called Frankfurt am Main when it was Kristallnacht in November of '38. His father was among that very first group of 30,000 Jewish men to be rounded up when they were first about to implement the final solution. He was among that first group of 30,000 to be deported to Dachau. And those early days of Dachau, the prisoners were actually allowed to leave if they could prove that they had passage out of Germany. So when Benny's mother found that out, she took her 3 children, Benny, who was the middle child, his older sister, and his infant sister. She took the 3 kids to the shipping lines and she tried to buy passage out of Germany. But the line was very long and she was right at the end of the line. And by the time she got to the ticket window, there were only 3 tickets left. Now, they needed 4. As a family of 5, the 2 youngest children could share a ticket, so they needed 4. But there were only, what did I say, 3? There were 2 tickets left. And Benny's mother, you know, she was hysterical, crying, because what could she do? She couldn't let the children go anywhere without her. They were too little. And she knew that whoever stayed behind at that point, it would be an automatic death sentence. And she was just beside herself, hysterically crying. And the people in front of her in line, it was an elderly couple. And they turned around and they saw her crying. And they said, "You have young children. You have to get out of Germany. We're old. We'll stay here." And they gave up their tickets. They gave their 2 tickets to Benny's family so that they could all leave. And so his family ended up going the only place where they still had passage, which was China. And they lived in China for 8 years before continuing on to California and then eventually to Canada. So that was his story. You know, there's no end of stories. Every survivor has a different story. But I'll come back to this one really quickly. So the mouse and cherry blossoms, it's actually the name of experiments that are being done on epigenetics, which is a fairly new field of research. And it sets out to prove how trauma can be passed down through the generations genetically. So this is not nature versus nature versus nurture, where trauma is modeled somehow and behavior is learned. This field wants to know if it can be actually passed down through the DNA. So in Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, they're actually doing some really interesting experiments, and one of them is this mouse and cherry blossoms. And what they did was very interesting. They took a group of adult mice, and on the one hand, they exposed them to the smell of cherry blossoms. And at the same time, they paired that with an electric shock. So over time, when the mice came to smell the cherry blossoms, they would flinch and wince because they were expecting the electric shock. So this is classical Pavlovian conditioning, which I'm sure you know about. But these researchers took this experiment a step further. They took the offspring of the original group of adult mice. Now, these baby mice had never had an electric shock in their whole life. But when they smelled the smell of cherry blossoms, they reacted exactly like their parents did, with the same flinching and wincing as if they were about to feel pain. And the researchers take this to mean that yes, trauma can be passed down genetically. And, you know, for someone like me, a child of Holocaust survivors, and so many other children of survivors who I've now met and discussed this with, this explains so much. It explains so much about the unique kinds of anxieties and dreams and reactions to everyday stresses that we have. And, you know, I can't tell you how many times I've heard since this whole pandemic started. I can't tell you, so many of the children of survivors have said, well, we don't need to stock up our house. I've been stocked up for decades now. And it's, you know, this instinct of planning for some horrific event. And I did the same thing. You know, my house was stocked and ready for the axe to fall long before anybody ever heard the word coronavirus. Okay, so I think that's it for the slides. I don't know if any of you plan to read the book. If you do, I would love to hear your thoughts and your questions. Any questions? Wait, are we on mute? Anybody?
Hi, this is Sarah. Is
Hi.
there an orderly fashion or do we just chime in?
Jump in.
Okay. So, you know, I don't know if it's a big detail or a little detail, but it really strikes me how, I mean, there's so much like emotional, heavy stuff in here. Not the least of which would be having your brother be, you know, thought of as a suspect. And so I just want to know, I haven't read the book yet, but I do plan on reading it. You know, how that was for him, for you, for your parents. Um, you know, I often see people be accused of different things in the media. Um, and I cringe because I think, oh my goodness, if they're not guilty, you know, their image has already been impacted.
So I don't want to give away too
Okay.
much of it because that's a good little section at the beginning of the book. But I will say that the police had a very clever idea of why my brother would have committed this murder, and it was actually pretty logical. But it wasn't very long before they cleared him and pointed the finger at somebody else.
Okay.
And as it turns out, I knew the murderer too.
Wow. So the kind of the trauma and the emotions just continue at different levels.
Crazy story. Yeah. And the other thing I do want to add, because I started off this talk by telling you how much I wanted to be an author growing up. So one of the themes of the book is fate. You know, I always questioned, was it my parents' fate to survive when 6 million others didn't? And was it this poor woman's fate to die this horrible death the way she did? And then, was it my fate as an author to have the story fall into my lap? you know, here I was waiting for a story and wondering what I could write about. And then this happens to my family. And, you know, it wasn't even so much a matter of me wanting to write this book. It was more like a book clamoring to be written. So you know, that whole question of fate is it's right in there.
Wow.
Yeah. Any other questions? Well, Genevieve, then I think we should probably wrap it up for tonight.
All right. Debbie, that was grueling and incredible. Thank you for sharing your family's personal stories and making them personal for us. And thank you for making it part of your life to educate the world about them and what happened to them and so many other people like them. The book does sound incredibly interesting. I do want to mention that TCG Folk and Yala Twin Cities have a monthly book club, and the crate is an option that can be voted on right now for the people who are going to participate in May's gathering. So you can visit either Yala Twin Cities Facebook or TCG Folks Facebook. We're co-hosts of that event, and sign up for May's book club and vote for the crate if you want to read that and discuss it in the group. And yeah, that was really something, Debbie. I mean, I don't have words. Thank you so much though for your time and for sharing.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry. Go have a drink. That's the general. Yeah, I need one too.
Mm.
Well, I hope all of you stay safe and healthy and well. And I hope we're all let out of prison soon in a safe way.
Hope that for you too, Debbie. Thank you.
Thanks again for listening.
And we are going to have this recording on Facebook, and people can watch later. You can direct them there. This was very powerful, and I hope that people do see it.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
All right. Have a great night.
You too. Good night.